They didn't die from bullets. They didn't die from bombs. Some of them were burned alive. Some were buried under hundreds of their own comrades. Some begged for death for days before it finally came. And every single one of them was an American soldier. Chapter 1. We're going to talk about the deaths you were never taught in school. The ones too brutal for history textbooks. Too disturbing for memorial speeches. But before we get to the worst one, and trust me, nothing will prepare you for it, you need to understand just how far humanity is willing to go when war strips everything else away. Stay until the end, because the final story might be the most horrifying thing you've ever heard. Chapter 2. Over 1.3 million Americans have died in combat since this country was born. But death in war is never just numbered. Behind every statistic is a man, a face, a name, and sometimes a death so brutal, so prolonged, so unthinkable, that it forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What does war actually do to a human body? Today, we're going to find out. Chapter 3, The Civil War, Death by Medicine. Here's something they never put in the history books. In the American Civil War, more soldiers died from disease and medical treatment than from actual combat. Surgeons worked with unsterilized saws. Amputations took less than 10 minutes. Not because the doctors were skilled, but because speed was the only mercy they could offer. Soldiers would wake up on a battlefield, legs shattered by a mini ball, a bullet designed specifically to splinter bone on impact, and be carried to a field hospital that smelled like rotting flesh from 50 yards away. If you were lucky, they gave you whiskey before they cut. If you weren't, they held you down. And here's the part that makes this even darker. Thousands of soldiers who survived their wounds died weeks later. Not from infection, not from blood loss, from the doctors themselves. Physicians would move from patient to patient. Same unwashed hands, same contaminated instruments, spreading gangrene, erysipelas, and pyemia through entire wards. One soldier described lying in a tent, watching a man next to him turn black from the knee down. Within 3 days, that man was gone. He wrote in his diary, "I fear the hospital more than I fear the Confederates." He was right too. But as horrific as that was, it's nothing compared to what happened to men who were taken prisoner. Chapter 4, Andersonville, the death camp America forgot. If you've never heard the name Andersonville, you're about to wish you hadn't. Camp Sumter, Andersonville, Georgia, 1864. It was a Confederate prison camp built to hold 10,000 Union prisoners. They crammed in 45,000. Within months, it became the closest thing to a death camp on American soil. There was no shelter. Prisoners dug holes in the Georgia clay and called them homes. There was one water source, a creek that ran directly through the camp's latrine area. Men drank from the same stream they defecated in. Scurvy rotted their gums until their teeth fell out. Dysentery hollowed them from the inside. Prisoners described men so starved they could count every rib on a living body. 13,000 Union soldiers died in that camp. Not from bullets, not from battle, from thirst, from hunger, from diseases that ate them alive over weeks. And the worst part? Some of them had been within miles of rescue. Union forces were close enough. The prisoners knew it. They could hear distant artillery. But no prisoner exchange deal was struck in time. They died, knowing salvation was just over the horizon. Now, if Andersonville was the worst thing that happened to prisoners, what happened to soldiers on open battlefields was something else entirely. Chapter 5, The Crater. Buried alive in the Civil War. July 30th, 1864. Petersburg, Virginia. Union engineers spent a month digging a tunnel, 511 feet long, directly beneath Confederate lines. They packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The plan was simple: detonate the tunnel, blow a hole in Confederate defenses, rush through, end the siege of Petersburg. At 4:44 in the morning, they lit the fuse. What happened next was one of the most catastrophic military failures in American history. The explosion worked. It worked almost too well. It tore open a crater 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. Entire Confederate regiments were launched into the air. Men were buried alive under thousands of tons of earth. Some were found weeks later, still in position, perfectly preserved in the soil, rifles still in hand. Then the Union troops charged. And here's where it went horrifically wrong. Instead of going around the crater, they went into it. Hundreds of soldiers poured into the pit, realized they couldn't climb out, and were trapped. Confederate forces regrouped, surrounded the crater, and began firing down into it. It became a slaughter pit. Men couldn't run. They couldn't fight effectively. They were packed so tightly they could barely raise their rifles. Some witnesses described the scene as watching men boil in a bowl. Union soldiers were bayonet where they stood. Some were beaten with rifle, but when ammunition ran out, black Union troops, fighting for the first time in significant numbers, were shown zero mercy. Many were executed on the spot rather than taken prisoner. 4,000 Union casualties in under an hour, and Ulysses S. Grant later called it the saddest affair I have witnessed in the war. But nothing in the Civil War prepared America for what was about to happen in the trenches of Europe. Chapter 6, World War I, the death no one talks about. When people think of World War I, they think of trenches, mud, gas. But there's one type of death from that war that almost never gets discussed. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was so severe in some soldiers that their bodies physically shut down. Men went mute, completely mute, not from injury, from psychological trauma. So extreme their brains refused to function. Some soldiers were found wandering no man's land with no memory of who they were. Others shook violently and uncontrollably for years after the war ended. And the British and American militaries, not understanding what they were seeing, classified many of these men as cowards. Some were court-martialed, some were shot for the crime of having their minds destroyed by war. One American soldier, pulled from the front lines, was reported to scream continuously for 72 hours, not from a physical wound, but from what he'd seen. He was listed as a psychiatric case and returned to duty 6 weeks later. He didn't survive the next offensive, but even that pales next to what American soldiers encountered in the Pacific. Chapter 7, World War II, Burning on the Water. February 1942, the USS Juneau, a U.S. Navy cruiser carrying 700 men, including 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, the Sullivan Brothers, George, Frank, Joe, Matt, and Al. A Japanese torpedo found the Juneau's ammunition magazine. The ship exploded and sank in 20 seconds. 115 men survived the initial blast. For 8 days, they floated in shark-infested waters in the South Pacific. No rescue came. The Navy knew the ship had gone down, but feared that rescue operations would reveal their position to enemy submarines. So they waited. Sharks attacked survivors for days. Men who were wounded bled into the water. Others drowned from exhaustion. Some simply gave up, released their life jackets, and slipped beneath the surface. When rescue finally arrived, 8 days later, only 10 men were still alive. Of the 5 Sullivan brothers, not one survived. Their mother received 5 telegrams in a single day. The loss of the Sullivan brothers led directly to the sole survivor policy, the U.S. military rule that protects the last surviving member of a family from being sent to combat. That policy exists because of what happened to those 5 boys in the water. And yet, even that grief, even that horror, is not the worst death in this video. Chapter 8, the worst death of all. Korea, 1950, the Chosin Reservoir. Temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. American Marines were surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese soldiers. They were outnumbered 10 to 1. But what killed more men than bullets at Chosin was the cold itself. Morphine froze in syringes. Medics couldn't treat wounds because the blood froze before they could pack it. Men lost fingers, then hands. Feet turned black inside their boots. Marines described fallen comrades frozen solid in fighting positions, rifles still aimed as if still alive. And the men who survived had to use those frozen bodies as cover. They stacked their own dead like sandbags. One Marine wrote afterward, "The dead were the only ones who weren't suffering. They fought for 17 days in those conditions. No proper sleep, no warm food, no relief." But here's the part that defines the word brutal better than any other moment in American military history. When they finally broke out of the encirclement, Exhausted, frostbitten, barely alive, they didn't retreat. They called it an attack in a different direction, and they carried every single one of their dead with them, because they refused, even then, to leave anyone behind. Chapter 9, Conclusion, What It Cost. 1.3 million Americans. Dead. Not statistics. Not numbers on a memorial wall. Men who froze in Korean snow with rifles still in their hands. Men who burned in Pacific water for 8 days. Men who drowned in Georgia mud with salvation just out of reach. War doesn't just kill, it chooses how, and it chooses slowly. The next time you walk past a veteran's memorial, look at the names. Every single one of them has a story like this, and most of those stories will never be told. If you made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't sugarcoat history. Comment Chosin if the last story hit you differently. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, the most relevant video on this channel right now is sitting right there on your screen. We covered every major moment the US and Iran came within inches of starting World War III. Soldiers, missiles, decisions made in seconds that could have ended millions of lives. If brutal American military history is what you're here for, that video is your next watch. Don't sleep on it. And if you want more dark history that textbooks were too afraid to print, subscribe, because we're just getting started.